All right, welcome to another episode of the Accidental Landlord. I'm your host, Peter McKenzie. Today we are going to visit a nightmare tenant story. So we've obviously, been sharing all kinds of different stories from nightmare landlords. This is going to be one about a nightmare tenant. So back in the beginning of 2020, I think this was right before COVID, we put up a video about a nightmare tenant that we were brought in to assist with. And it was pretty bad. So obviously being a landlord can be pretty rewarding, can be financially rewarding, but it doesn't come without risks. And today we're going to talk about what those risks are. And, there's a stereotype out there that all landlords are rich and have deep pockets and just make tons of money off of their tenants. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. There are plenty of landlords who make a living in the landlord business, but the risk that they are exposed to is pretty wild, and let's talk about what this is. So this was in the beginning of 2020. We were called out. Somebody reached out to our office and said, "Hey, I got a property I want to rent out. Would love to have you guys come take a look." So I go out there. It was back when I was still doing sales for our company. Met with the owner, and we can just call him John for the sake of the story we're telling. He walks me through the house. And the house was destroyed, absolutely destroyed. Drywall missing, appliances ripped out, plumbing out, floor gone, trash everywhere. I don't even think they had a trash, they didn't have a trash service that collected their trash weekly like most normal people do. So he proceeded to tell me this story that he owns his house. He's had it rented. He has had a tenant in there that hadn't paid rent in 6 months. Well, I go, well, were you managing it yourself, or how did this come about? And he goes, no, I had a relative managing it. And I go, oh, were they like a realtor or property manager or something? He's like, no, they just decided, they said that they could do it for us. So that's the first red flag. You shouldn't have people manage your property that don't know what they're doing or don't have any experience with it. Anyway, he said that he didn't want to pay a management fee because there wasn't a lot of, extra left over after all the bills were paid, so he had his relative manage it. Well, it was roughly about a $3,000 a month rental. 6 months of not renting it resulted in roughly $18,000 in lost rent. Now they tried to do the eviction themselves, so the tenant stops paying rent. They decided they don't want to pay a lawyer, they're going to do the eviction themselves. Well, that's why it took 6 months, because when you try to do an eviction on your own, first off, the deck is stacked against you. You're dealing with the courthouse and lawyers and judges, and the paperwork is very complex. And some people, I suppose, could figure it out. But the problem is, you check one little box wrong or you miss one little deadline, it usually restarts the clock. And that's how you hear these stories about landlords who, I couldn't get my tenant out for 2 years. And most of the time it's them trying to do it themselves, or they have someone helping them who has no idea what they do. Because when you get attorneys involved, it's rare that an eviction would take that long. So that was one of the problems. Eventually, though, they failed too many times on their own. They hired an attorney. I don't know which attorney they hired, and then they were eventually able to get the tenant out of the property. In the meantime, property gets destroyed. Probably wasn't in the best shape when they stopped paying rent, but I can guarantee you it probably got a lot worse during the eviction. So that's another reason why it's important to get, if you get to an eviction, to get the tenants out fast, to do things the right way, and have somebody who knows what they're doing, because these tenants absolutely destroyed the property. And to make matters worse, once the eviction was actually happening, I'm sure once the lawyer stepped in and did it the right way, the tenants called code enforcement at the property that they destroyed and gave them a laundry list of all the things that were wrong with the property. Now, this was an older property. I think it was like over 70 years old. Had unpermitted work done at certain points, maybe before the guy who called us out there even owned the house. Well, now the city served the owner of the property with like a 15-item list of code violations that have to be remedied before they'll make the property habitable again. So the property is essentially red tagged and has all these violations against it. Which I don't recall off the top of my head. There were things definitely like about unpermitted structures that were added onto the property. There was no heat, there was no running water, there were all these issues because of all the damage that the tenants did. So let's just recap what this person was facing. One was $18,000 in lost rent. My rough estimate from walking the property, and obviously this is a property ultimately we didn't end up managing, so we just had the one interaction with the person. It's probably about $100,000 worth of work to get the property back into a rentable condition. And this was back then. I mean, now it would probably be even more with inflation. So it was all new flooring, new drywall, new plumbing, light fixtures, heaters, appliances, basically almost like a full remodel for the house. So I put it at $100,000. He also was out legal fees, which I don't know exactly what the legal fees are, but if you do an eviction that's uncomplicated, they're anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000. But in this case, my guess is it was a bigger mess. It was probably a little bit more. And then you had to pay to fix all of the code violations. And who knows? Like, if I recall, there was like some sort of addition on the property that was unpermitted that they were going to make them tear off. The cost of that could be, who knows, because they could either just tear it off and remove it, or they could try to get it permitted after the fact, or whatever. I think, just conservatively, let's call that another 50 grand. So here we have someone, $100,000 worth of damage, $50,000 worth of code work that needed to be done. That's $150, $18,000 in lost rent. That's $168, and say another $10,000 in legal fees. We're up to $188,000. That's a pretty bad story. That's a pretty bad day if you're a landlord. In some cases, if you're a new landlord, that's probably more than the equity you have in the house. But obviously, if you've had the house for a long time, it's not that big of a deal. You might be able to survive from this. You take some financing out on the house, you get it fixed. But if you're not in a position to do that, that's a potentially lethal blow to a landlord. Really hard to come back from that. So after this was all, I did my tour with him, and he told me the story about what happened, and it was time for me to make some recommendations. So my recommendations were, you got to fix the property up, because if you don't fix the property up, one, it's not inhabitable. The city's not going to let you rent it out. You can't rent out a unit in this shape. This is a good opportunity to bring, to modernize the house a bit, because you're already doing all the work. You got, make the house nice again so you can attract a good tenant and put the tenant in there. Well, after I made my recommendations to this gentleman, he looked at me basically and said, I'm not going to spend $1 more than the bare minimum to get this property ready to rent. And the things that I was suggesting he do, he wasn't really interested in, which is a shame, because in the landlord business, if you have a bad property that's ugly, that's dirty, that's not attractive, guess what kind of tenant it attracts? A bad tenant. A tenant who's probably going to do the same things that his previous tenant did to him, because good tenants don't want to live in bad properties. And put yourself in their shoes. Why would you? You want to live in a property that's nice and updated and taken care of. But here he was, who just got into a huge problem, legal and financial issues. He's not willing, or maybe he's not able, to bring the property back to where it needs to be so that they can rent it. I also suggested to him that you need to put a management company in place, because clearly you don't have the time to deal with it. Whoever you put in place got you into this mess. Please hire a professional to prevent all of this stuff from happening to you. And he went right back to, I'm not going to spend $1 more. I can't afford a management company, and we're just going to figure it out on our own. Hence, he's probably in the same shoes. I don't know what happened to him. After that, it was very disappointing, but I wanted to bring it on the podcast and talk about it, because it was 100% avoidable. There's so many things that could have been done that weren't done that would have saved him all this headache. I mean, can you imagine the number of sleepless nights knowing that this was happening at your property and what the extent of it was? All that could have been prevented. So let's talk about that. How do you prevent this from happening to you? One, you got to vet the tenants. More than likely, I don't know, but more than likely when your relative is managing your property who has no idea what they're doing, they're probably not running a credit check, talking to landlords, doing all the due diligence that's required to figure out if the tenant's going to be good or not. How can you do that? Well, there's plenty of self-help options. Zillow, there's a bunch of softwares that are designed for people who are managing on their own. If they wanted to run a credit check, they can. Or hire a management company. That's kind of the easy button. Okay, 2, you got to think, this person wasn't managing this property like it was a business. He was literally just trying to figure it out as he went, and clearly it didn't work out. That is the biggest mistake that I see people making is if you're going to be a landlord, which a lot of people are, hence the title of our show, accidentally end up being landlords, whether they inherit a property or have to move out of the area and they want to keep the property. You have to treat it like a business. If you don't, it is not a defense when you're sued by your tenant that, oh, I didn't know that, or I'm just, I'm not a big landlord. I'm just have this property. You have to treat it like a business. And if you don't have the time to learn what that is, what's entailed in doing that, then you should hire a property management company, because you have all the same exposure to liability that giant 300-unit apartment complex has. It's the same. And just because you're a little mom and pop investor doesn't mean you get a pass on all the laws and rules and regulations that landlords face. So that's a big deal. Another thing is this person might have been set up for this scam from the beginning. We don't know because we weren't there when the property was rented and we weren't involved in the screening of the tenant, but they could have put in a tenant who had a game plan, a playbook on that they do this to landlords, which we also see. We call them professional tenants. They usually prey on mom and pop landlords that they know aren't sophisticated. They haven't seen the scams. That could have been what's going on here. So if you're going to be a landlord and you're going to do this yourself, you owe it to yourself to educate yourself on what the scams are. Now, our society, it's so disheartening that there are scammers who literally target industries to scam. I was at the grocery store the other day, and on the right behind the register for the cashiers to look at, they're like, watch out for these scams. And they listed a couple of scams that people try to pull at the grocery store. In our business, there's 2 or 3 scams that everybody tries to pull. And it's usually along the lines of stealing a security deposit from some unknowing tenant, somebody sitting in another country somewhere trying to represent that they own properties and trying to get money that way, or scamming a landlord. Once they move into the property, they immediately stop paying rent and, start claiming habitability issues, or they're releasing insects, or there's all kinds of scams that people pull. Short-term rentals, those are hit with the same scams over and over again. It's a bummer that we live in a society like that. Obviously not the point of this video, but that very well could have happened to this gentleman and him not even know it because they didn't know what they were doing. And those are the types of people who do the things that happened to that poor gentleman. So the other thing that he didn't do, which he could have saved him probably a lot of money, is he didn't act quickly. They tried to do this eviction on their own. They lost precious, valuable time, which probably equated into more damage to the property. The second you have a tenant who stops paying rent, you need a rent collection policy, and you need to enforce the rent collection policy equally across the board to everybody. He obviously didn't do that. If he would have done that and he would have hired an attorney in the beginning, he probably would have got his property back in better condition than the condition that he actually got it back in. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is there are insurance products that are designed for this very issue. In fact, we offer an insurance product to our clients through a company that has an insurance product against eviction, malicious tenant damage, and lost rent. So if this was one of our clients and they had purchased this insurance policy from this company, they would have made a claim on the policy. I don't think it would have covered all this because I think the malicious tenant damage is only $50,000, but this is obviously an egregious case. But if they had been with a management company who offered these types of options to them, they potentially would have had an insurance policy to cover them from this. But the reality is, if they've been a management company, they probably never would have got into this situation in the first place. But there are things out there. Our advice is, if you're going to manage your property, you owe it to everyone to do your homework and really understand the business that you're in. And if you don't, hire a professional who does. So let's wrap this thing up, because I am not interested in rambling, even though I frequently have been accused of rambling on these podcasts. Number one, make sure you're doing it the right way. Make sure you educate yourself. And if you don't have the time, hire a management company. If you want to keep learning through examples like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring these kinds of stories purely for the purpose of helping educate newer landlords on what these scams are, how these things work, so you can hopefully not let it happen to you. And finally, if you're in our area and you want to have a conversation about this, or you want to not let this happen to you and you want to turn over the management of your property, we're happy to have that conversation too. This isn't a fear piece. We're not trying to scare people into, oh, if you manage property on your own, this is what's going to happen. But this does happen, and I wish it didn't, but this is not an unusual story. It's a high dollar story, but there's people that make mistakes that cost them money all the time that we talk to, which is unfortunate. Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully this was a valuable piece of information that can steer you away from making the same mistakes that this gentleman did. And yeah, that'll do. Thank you. Have a good day.